Hello, everybody. Catchy1383 with Catchy Gaming. And while I'm trying to work out the logistics of a bigger video and more or less in terms of how I'm going to just do it, I decided to work on my backlog of games/reviews. I actually never really intended to review this game, but I kind of liked it enough that I figured I would cover it. Especially with technically, I guess, the third entry into the series, along with the sequel-ish to this one, coming out next month on the 20th. So this is the Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales, a direct sequel to the 2018 game released on the PS4 and released again as a remastered for both PS4 and the PS5, which is kind of weird because the sequel coming out is Marvel's Spider-Man 2. I guess they're making a distinction even though both the characters are in the game. That's besides the point. We're just going to talk about Miles Morales specifically. This one didn't quite have the same feeling as the 2018 Spider-Man game. I mean, it felt pretty similar in the same way that all the Batman Arkham games are similar, which I guess this game is also similar to that, but it felt a little slower at times. And what I mean by that actually sort of manifests in two different categories. When you're running around the cities web slinging, it doesn't quite feel as smooth or as fast as the 2018 Spider-Man, which may have been done on purpose, but it doesn't feel like you're actually on the move when you're swinging around. It feels like you're, pardon the pun, because Miles gets called molasses by the villain of the game, you kind of feel like you're Spider-Man swinging through molasses. There are times in which you do feel like you are gaining a great deal of speed, but it just doesn't feel like you're actually going that fast. Even when you get, I guess, contributions to your speed milestone, we'll just call it that because it wasn't really all that important that I get all those, because most of the time when it came to earning experience, which is another aspect that sort of slowed it down, all the little things in between, like stopping crimes, which they eventually just repeated the same crimes over and over again, which kind of detracted from it. I think even the Spider-Man tie-in movie for the second one back in the 2000s had more crimes going on it than this. This one just repeated way too much in terms of that. But you get XP for it, and you would get very, very little for doing things in the game outside of the main story missions. And then there's the combat itself. Very similar to that of the Arkham games, like I stated before, maybe a little bit more refined it's in some ways. Yes, it looks like they definitely learned from those games, but in some cases it gets a little too busy, and it does detract from it in some sense. At times it'll feel like you're swinging, making kicks and a whole bunch of other things, and it feels fast and that you have to get going in before you get beat up. Like right here on my screen, I'm being extremely klutzy, and it's just taking forever for him just to swing the garbage can to hit a guy with a gun. And this is when I first started playing my backlog game, so I was still getting used to the controls. I'm much better than this. But it definitely feels like it gets a little too busy, a little too grindy. In some cases, it's like they take way too many hits, even the most basic criminals, just to knock you out when you first start the game. It gets better as you level up, but when you're first starting out, it just sort of drags on. Each fight just won't stop. And in some cases, you have some crimes like saving a feast truck. You knock out two guys, they magically bring in a truck full of other people to come and help the guys you just knocked out. And when you defeat them, they bring even more in, and it just turns into the slog of beating them up. And when you get into some scenarios where you're not really as familiar or as good with the mechanics, you can get into some really long fights that just take way too long to punch out all the enemies in the room. Or in some cases, even when you are familiar with this stealth, it just takes an exceedingly long time to knock all these guys out via stealth. And speaking of stealth, they have some encounters in the game where they're like take out enemies, but they're smack dab in the middle of a roof, and the nearest roof is 50 feet up in the air, so you can't drop down on them, and you have to wait for your cloaking ability to either be charged or recharged, and you have to take one guy out, wait, and once the meter's charged up again, you have to do it all over again. Or you could just hope you encounter it in a different spot with better buildings around or something like that. And I wish I could say the combat is pretty smooth overall, but sometimes it's not. Like, at all. You'll have a bunch of enemies that you want to fight, and it automatically just tells you which one you're going to attack instead of the one that you have deemed to be the bigger threat. I've literally had Miles here shoot his web past a guy that was directly in front of me that I wanted to take out to grab a guy behind him, and the guy that I wanted to grab ended up smacking me in the face with a shield. It might have been a club. Either way, the point is, there's a lot of, I guess it's supposed to be hand-holding, but it hand-holds a little too much. And they do that for the web slinging as well. And if you want to find out what the flaws are for web slinging, do the traverse training for Miles. They have 3 of them when it comes to learning how to use the webs. And the final challenge is by far the hardest. Like, unmercifully the hardest. And you kind of find out what the flaws are, and you try and have to more or less figure out how to work with them and maybe even control it in your favor in order to get that time, in order to get the best rating you can for the training. And part one of the biggest problems is that he doesn't always shoot his webs at the stuff that's in the center of the screen. He'll sometimes even do it when you're not even pointing at something on the screen. I could be pointing slightly to my right and he'll shoot something down and slightly to my left versus the thing that I wanted to go to, which is up and to my right. And some things that kind of sort of sabotages you just a little bit is it does affect how you swing by what hand he's shooting web out of. He'll shoot web out of both his left and his right, and if he shoots web out of his left when you want to turn right, yes, you can still sort of turn right. It's awkward, but it's not as effective as if he had the web in his right hand. In a clear attempt to separate Miles from the regular Spider-Man, they gave him 2 abilities. One they call Venom, which they made this whole entire thing like, yeah, that's a good name for it, which in hindsight of the main villain or possible main villain for the sequel coming out, probably not the best choice of name for the powers. And then he also has the ability to cloak. So these abilities are actually kind of neat because they do integrate them into taking on various enemies throughout the game that are unique to Miles Morales. And once you get a hang of it and you unlock all these abilities, Miles is pretty powerful, maybe a little too OP in some cases. And some of those enemies that were a little spongy are not nearly as spongy as they once were. Now, there is one thing that does drive me off the bat is they have a couple of enemies with melee weapons. Let's say a pipe, baseball bat, crowbar, just in general a melee weapon. and these guys can block, and Miles will just keep pummeling at him regardless because they didn't. I don't. Adam means to strike lower with, say, their legs, but never mind that the pipe, crowbar, or whatever they have is narrow. It's more narrow than their bodies, but they're still magically blocking every single last attack he's making. That's more of a game design flaw, along with a poor choice in, I guess, object to be using to block with. And it's one of the things that I feel detracts from this game, is a guy blocking every single last attack with a crowbar. Now, it sounds like I'm complaining a lot, but to be honest, it wasn't that bad. There's plenty of fast travel if you really don't want to do the web slinging. I did it anyways, just for the fun of it. And the combat, it's okay when you have smaller groups of enemies, and it gets better, like I said, when you're in the later game, especially if you're doing a new game plus, because you get even more boost to your combat abilities. And overall, it was enjoyable enough to go through it again. It was much better off with the first time, and the only reason why I actually played through it again was to earn the Platinum Trophy. I would say it's entertaining enough to play through at least once. The story, on the other hand, wasn't all that intriguing. It kind of has these Marvel tropes that are associated with their comics nowadays, like the super smart villain and protagonist developing super technology way beyond anything that's currently available by one person in a garage in the middle of rundown New York with nothing but technology from the 80s and probably 90s and 2000s as well. I mean, Miles and the villain made a GPU while in middle school, and that's one hell of a thing to make for middle school, considering they would be set for life if they could do that in middle school. And there's a lot that goes into making a GPU, and I studied computer engineering. I'm in the process of earning that degree, and somehow they're magically building this while in middle school without the same facilities necessary to do so for anything that would have been made back in probably been the equivalent of the mid 2010s is when he would have been in middle school with this game's plot. It has that unfortunate trope of people who've never actually learned about technology, biology, and all that other fun stuff writing science fiction for technology, biology, and all that other fun stuff. Yes, it's fiction, but they went a little overboard. I mean, Iron Man has a whole entire company dedicated to that. Miles Morales and his friend, who is the villain, who is obviously the villain. Let's not forget about that whole entire obvious villain thing, too, are in middle school. I don't know what facilities they could have possibly had gotten their hands on in order to make a GPU. Then there's the whole entire cliche of evil corporation doing evil thing and somebody going to other means that are considered evil or just as evil to destroy evil corporation, possibly hurting other people in the whole entire scenario kind of plot point. And I noticed right away they started recycling a lot of characters, so it was pretty obvious who the villain was going to be before they revealed who the villain was going to be. But at least they actually showed it pretty early on, instead of being like, oh no, that character's the villain. So I will give them that. But they did go for another cliche with a villain doing a sort of redemption arc at the end, sacrificing themselves to save other people, even though they were the ones to cause the thing to happen in the first place. So overall, I would say this game is definitely worth playing at least once. And I'm guessing some of these issues might have been because it was being made on the PS5. I don't know if that would have been too much of a difficult thing going from the PS4 to the PS5. But it was fun enough to play once, and it was short enough, which I definitely liked, that I was willing to get a platinum on it. So anyways, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. Have a good one.